Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together BBC specialists with foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, England gets back its freedom from COVID restrictions, that is. But how long will it last? In Cuba and in South Africa, thousands have taken to the streets protesting at their respective plight. Two popular revolutions betrayed? With me this week are Stephanie Bolson of Germany's Die Welt, Michael Goldfarb, whose blog aims to be the first rough draft of history, hence its title, and here in the studio with me, the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, James Lander. Welcome, James, and welcome to both of you. Lovely to see you both again, albeit at a distance for now. Now, Monday will be what Boris Johnson once liked to call Freedom Day, the one on which all the legal restrictions imposed on people in this pandemic will be lifted. Prime Minister Boris Johnson used to say this final stage of unlocking would be irreversible. Now he's not so sure. Globally, COVID appears to be on the march again. Cases are rising in France, Germany, in the Netherlands and Spain. In Indonesia, Japan and Vietnam, it seems rampant. Stephanie, first, the Dutch government under Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister, announced, I think 3 weeks ago or so, that restrictions were being lifted. And he's now had to reimpose some of them. And he's even apologised, saying it was a mistake. How worrying a precedent is that for the UK, do you think?
I think this is, I'm afraid, very much a precedent for the UK. I mean, as you say, Mark Rutte had to apologise. So politically, it has been very, very difficult for him. And I wonder what is next for Boris Johnson in that sense. So if you look at the Netherlands, and of course, the reason for this is the Delta mutation, because the Delta mutation is far more infectious than the variant we had before. So in the Netherlands, there's a 500% rise in infections. And there were a lot of mass gatherings. So there were some music festivals allowed again. And of course, you can understand we are all fed up with it. And it's summer, you want to go outside. But there was from one not too big music festival, 500 new infections. And I was covering the Euros in Wembley in the last weeks and thinking of 65,000 people in Wembley and far more people around, people celebrating all over the country. We don't know yet how many infections that will have caused, but this is one thing. And then on Monday, opening the floodgates, so to say, I think we will look into quite a bleak infection scenario in the next weeks in the UK.
Michael, the British are fortunate in that they have not only been able to afford and source quite sufficient numbers of vaccine doses, in fact more than enough over the coming few months and the year we've already seen, but they have a population that on the whole has embraced vaccination. That is the argument that Downing Street would doubtless use to say why we are different to what we've seen in the Netherlands and elsewhere. But I wonder if there's potentially a risk that it's created a false sense of security in the UK.
Well, I think it has created a false sense of security in the government, and certainly amongst the conservative backbenchers who, would probably describe themselves as libertarian. But it really is false. I mean, I saw some polling in the last 48 hours that said 57% of the British population was thinking about carrying on with precautions anyway, because they are aware that, yes, we have a high vaccination rate, and that's good, but, the younger people, people under 30 have not really been vaccinated. And this is in distinction to a lot of our, allies. And, you're just going to end up with this Delta variation running rampant. I mean, when Stephanie was talking about 65,000 people at Wembley, you're also talking about tens of thousands in Leicester Square and in downtown Manchester, not really observing much social distancing because they're a little bit too drunk to do so. And, we'll see. I would expect that in 10 to 14 days, there's going to be an incredible spike. And I'm not the only one. Sajid Javid, the Secretary of Health, says so as well. But what's really interesting is, we're talking about a near ally and competitor in the Netherlands. But look at Israel. Israel had pretty much stuffed this thing down. Normal life had pretty much resumed in the middle of June in Tel Aviv, and now they are having, because of the virulence of the Delta variation, they're starting to reimpose restrictions. And one final point, which is, it's clear and has always been clear since January, February 2020, that some kind of herd immunity, let the thing go wild through the population and people would develop natural immunity, was a point of view within the cabinet. And they're doing it now, but they're doing it on the backs of children. School kids, we're coming to the end of the term. Many schools have already shut down. You know, if not officially a grade here or a year there, because kids have it. And it's going to continue to flow through them throughout the summer. And, you know, it wouldn't be the first time in history that Boris Johnson has to backtrack with whiffle and waffle, as some people like to call it, and say, well, you know, we've got to change again.
James, prior to doing the diplomatic beat, you spent many years at Westminster, so you have some sense of the political background to some of this and the kind of thinking. Do you think the government is making this move, notwithstanding what's happened? Because in some ways, at least they can't be blamed for the choices that people have to make, and that they would argue, actually, in the end, the pandemic to some extent has infantilized people. It's kind of, well, we'll just do what the government tells us. And they want people to take ownership of their own health and their own risk factors.
Yes, they do, but voters throughout the world tend not to respond very well to, if they're forced to take responsibility for their actions, and if those actions don't necessarily work, they quite often blame their governments for giving them that responsibility. So you still get the blame anyway later on. Look, I mean, the government is acting because it's under pressure. It's under pressure politically from its own backbenchers, and also it's under pressure economically from businesses saying, look, you've got to relax things. What's happened is that they've allowed the narrative to become this extraordinary phrase, Freedom Day. And the lesson,
I think... To be fair, this is a word that the Prime Minister used. It's not something that journalists made up. It was a phrase that he was using.
And the point is that, you know, the lesson that is clearly obvious to everybody around the world is that this pandemic is something we are going to have to get used to, and we are going to be rolling with it, and we are going to have to change. Sometimes we're going to have our foot on the pedal and increase restrictions. Sometimes we'll be able to take it off, and then there'll be a new variant that will come up, and it won't. Our particular vaccination won't deal with it as effectively others. So, in other words, it's about governments learning to balance those competing pressures of health and economy and politics. And I think the risk is that by sort of allowing the impression to get there that somehow Monday clears the decks and it's freedom from there on in, makes it politically harder for the government to reimpose some restrictions in the future if that's what was required.
Let me just bring in both your kind of direct experiences in your home countries, Stephanie and Michael. Stephanie first. We obviously heard Angela Merkel say at one point she didn't want Brits coming into the UK. She wanted them all to go into quarantine. Then that didn't work in Europe-wide, and now it's not happening in Germany either. What's the situation, though, in Germany in terms of the domestic side? How are the restrictions being eased? Because there has been a fair amount of resistance, and there have been quite a few protests. And how are they looking now in the run-up to this forthcoming general election?
Well, as you say, I mean, there are still some restrictions in place, but very few, simply because the cases have gone down dramatically. I mean, they were very, very low for quite a long time, but now because of the Delta mutation is also now dominant in Germany, the cases are rising as well. So when Merkel actually said she didn't want any Brits to come to the continent, first of all, there were many countries who resisted that because of the tourism, so Portugal and Spain, for example. But then also the German Chancellor had to understand that it didn't make much sense because Delta was already almost prevalent in Germany. So there is no restrictions now for Brits to come into the country. Saying this, of course, it's a very delicate situation because at the end of September, there's a federal election. And the government will be in the same situation like the British government. Which way do you choose now? And it's a real dilemma. And compared with the UK, I think Germans were far more feisty in a way. And there were a lot of protests, and they did not follow the rules. And it's also a federal country, so the Länder, so the regions decide. So it's a hard task for her, though. Of course, she's not standing anymore. It's going to be for her successor, who might be the next Chancellor, Armin Laschet.
Michael, in the States, Joe Biden was talking a lot about the importance of 4th of July, of course, American Independence Day. 4th of July has been and gone. The impression from outside is that America is a lot more open than it was even a matter of months ago.
Well, it is open to foreign tourists. Well, if you've got tests and so on, I mean, you can fly in from Britain, but you have to, fly from Britain to Italy. You've got to show recent tests and that you don't have it. The problem that Joe Biden faces, of course, is like everything in America, except what time of day it is And even there's probably partisan arguments. You know, you have large swathes of the South and the middle of the country where there's such resistance to vaccination. And, you know, you have these holidays, and then it happened at Memorial Day as well. People get together in large bunches, and then 2 weeks later, there's a spike in a given state. So he has his work cut out for him. I mean, there's some very good graphics that people can find out there at the New York Times and just on Google that shows state by state how many people have had double vaccination or at least a single vaccination and where there's very low take-up. So Joe Biden's work is actually convincing a significant chunk of the population to get at least one shot. So it's a slightly different situation than here in Britain where, you know, we were all rushing, you know, waiting for our phones to ping, going back to January, saying, oh, it's your turn. You know, I'm up the road, jab me. In America, it's entirely different.
Thank you all very much. We will see. Only just a few days to go, and it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is after a few days when we're back with Dateline, same time next week. Now, one country saw peaceful but revolutionary change. In the other, it was by force of arms. Cuba and South Africa do have some things in common. The political organisation which wrought the change is still in charge. And this week, they've both been consumed by widespread violent protests. James, let's talk about South Africa first. The proximate cause was the arrest after he gave himself up of President Zuma, former President Zuma had been convicted of contempt of court. But there's clearly bigger forces at work here. What is your sense of what's driving these protests?
An extraordinary confluence of events, a power struggle within the ruling ANC, with all the latent dissatisfaction of a really bad economic experience, you know, sort of massive unemployment, huge inequality, poverty, plus the ever-presence of COVID, as we were talking just now, and shocking rates of cases and very low vaccination rates. So, I mean, let's be clear. The reports coming out of South Africa, it's very clear now that there was an attempt by supporters of Jacob Zuma in various ways to try and destabilise the government of Cyril Ramaphosa.
So some of it was organised.
Oh no, a lot of it was organised. You know, and you know, it hasn't just been shopping centres that have been attacked and looted. It's also been you know, specific, you know, oil refineries, hospitals, specific economic routes where lorries have been torched. So in other words, you know, at worst, well, at best, it was an attempt to try and destabilise Cyril Ramaphosa's government and maybe force him to release Mr. Zuma. At worst, I've read reports of people talking about attempted coups. This was an act of insurrection that then spiralled out of control in an orgy of violence that has led to extraordinary economic hit on South Africa's economy. Businesses which will be incredibly hard to restore. Huge uncertainty, queues for basic foodstuffs, vaccination centres have been ripped apart, ambulances have been targeted. So in other words, the economy and the battle against COVID have been damaged by what's happened there.
In terms of the situation in South Africa, Stephanie, that we think of it as, you know, the great success story in lots of ways of African politics, that here was a minority, white, racist regime that defined people purely by the colour of their skin, whether they were black, coloured, white, and everything about their lives was determined from that point, still in existence up until, you know, the late 20th century. A relatively peaceful transition, that confidence in a constitution that Cyril Ramaphosa helped to write, because he was one of the Mandela team back then, now looks as though it hasn't delivered to enough people the quality of life that is even the most basic quality of life. And all those promises, it'll come, you just have to be patient and all the rest of it. Patience seems to have run out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Ramaphosa is, of course, he was a figure of hope. And if you remember the Desmond Tutu term of the Rainbow Nation and bringing people together, bringing all the ethnicities together, and especially talking about, and James talked about that before, social inequality. One thing is poverty, but the other thing is also social inequality. And the inequality, of course, drives into anger of people. And this anger has really been shown now in Durban. I mean, I've been reading what the colleagues are writing from Durban, and it's really disturbing. It's shocking, the kind of the dimension of looting, the violence there, and of course the fear, will it spread? And then of course for Ramaphosa, it's now the challenge to prove in the last moment, so to say, that he is a figure of hope and that he will maintain the rule of law, that he will not give in to the protests and the pressure from a wing from the ANC. But of course, as James explained, is it more? Is it actually a coup? Is it a hidden coup? How can he actually gain control back? It is a very big country. There is a lot of crime, a lot of layers of history, as you say. And this has, of course, now been exacerbated by the pandemic, which is not in many places in the world is as bad as in South Africa.
Michael, some cynics, at very least skeptics, will say revolutions consume themselves.
Yeah, well, they usually do. Maybe not in America, although we seem to be
not yet.
250 years late to the buffet table. Look, what was interesting about the situation in Cuba and in South Africa, I mean, the simultaneity is something. COVID, obviously, is a spark. To see pictures from Cuban hospitals. Cuba's great revolutionary success, of course, was training a generation of doctors who go all over the world to poor countries, and in their own country they have excellent health care. And to see the condition of the hospitals and to see COVID patients on awful, filthy trolleys in Havana hospitals, you get to begin to understand why this broke out. But I mean, this is kind of a bigger theme. It's not just Cuba. You know, in Cuba it's a political football. In America, you've got the Miami Cubans on the right. You've got, you know, the American left who want to support the revolution, which is it's a totally corrupted one-party, one-family rule. I mean, there's nothing to support there. But what's interesting to me is that if you think back to when South Africa threw off apartheid, early 90s, when you think of Iraq today, there is a generation of people who are 30 years old, say, and they probably have started families of their own. They have known nothing but kind of post-dictatorship, pre-democratic, grotesquely corrupt societies. Iraq, we don't talk enough about Iraq. I mean, there's demonstrations all the time. You know what kind of repression is needed to keep Egypt, keep the lid on in Egypt. We see what's happening in South Africa. We see what's happening in Cuba. And I think that it is the long-noted demographic bulge. There's so many people, young people, who want more, who've, through the internet, through intervention by the United States and the G7 powers, been opened up to the idea of democracy, but their daily lives are ground down by horrendous corruption. And COVID has given them a spark to come into the streets and say, no, we will not live like this anymore. It's inchoate, but it is sweeping these parts of the world where we have had a great deal of influence since, I'd say, the early 1990s.
And yet another reason why this whole question of global vaccination matters in our own kind of self-interest as well. Stephanie, you used to go to Cuba relatively regularly. What was your impression of the country then?
Oh, it was a complete oppressive regime. I used to travel when I was a little bit younger to Cuba and actually help dissidents. And it felt like, I mean, you know, many people have been to Cuba. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And by the way, this is also one of the problems or why the protests have started, because the tourists are not coming anymore. And the tourism, of course, is one of the main income sources for Cubans. But it was shocking to meet people who have been fighting or standing up in Cuba just for the most basic rights, just to express their political opinion and to have fair elections, and how they were treated and how they were disappeared and how they were killed in times. That was something that's a memory that will always stay with me, especially coming from Germany.
James, finally, just on this, the relationship between the United States and Cuba is a fascinating one, and it is not least in its peculiarity. Joe Biden has stuck with the Trump sanctions. He hasn't lifted them, and the Cubans have used this as an excuse to say, well, it's really the Americans' fault. If only they'd lift the embargo, we could feed you and everything would be right again. Is it kind of a diplomatic mistake, do you think, to keep a country like Cuba under that embargo and give them this brilliant excuse?
Look, there are a lot of people who say, yes, Mr. Biden should see if he can readopt what Mr. Obama did, particularly by opening up, relaxing sanctions, allowing the remittances to go, all that money to go from Cubans in America to
of which there are a huge number.
I'm not an expert in the politics of Florida, but I'm told that is a key part of it. The Democratic Party are trying to defend themselves in key races. They don't want to pick a fight with powerful Cuban Republicans at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a little bit of politics in this. So at the moment, Joe Biden is being very specific. Yesterday himself at the press conference with Chancellor Merkel said he referred to Cuba as a failed state, and he said we are not going to shift on remittances.
Fascinating. It's going to be one to watch, certainly, and of course the situation in South Africa too. Let me finally ask each of you, as in the few minutes we have left, to tell us about some other things you think we should be watching that maybe haven't had enough attention so far. Michael first.
Well, there's something going on in America. There's always something going on in America. This is local politics. A lot of us here in Britain and around the world think, oh, well, Joe Biden's president, and then Donald Trump is making noise, down in Mar-a-Lago, but he's done. The Republican Party and the crisis in American democracy is not done. And earlier this week, the Democrats in the Texas state legislature fled, it's a loaded word, but they flew to Washington so that there would not be a quorum, so that no business could be transacted in the Texas state legislature. Why? Because the Republican majority wanted to change the rules on voting and to sharply curtail the ability of people to vote, particularly African Americans and people from poorer communities. Voting day is usually a Tuesday. Well, a lot of people have jobs where they actually can't take the day off. So there's all kinds of ways now you can vote, and the Texas legislature is trying to cut them all back. It is voter suppression. The Democrats are in the minority. They couldn't hope to stop this bill, so they simply removed themselves so that there wouldn't be a quorum and no business could be conducted. That is where politics is at in America. Joe Biden is trying to pass a $3 trillion infrastructure bill and bailout bill, all of these things. People should really be paying attention to what's happening in the state houses, particularly the ones controlled by the Republican Party, which seems to really be making a strong effort to turn America into one-party state, even though they are not in the majority nationally.
Stephanie, talking of elections, you mentioned the election in Germany already, and then this week we had the terrible flooding.
Yes, of course. And while, of course, that's for the time being very much in the news everywhere, but this is also very political because it is now a challenge for the Spitzenkandidat, so the likely successor in the job for Angela Merkel, Armin Laschet, who, by the way, is also the prime minister of the land where are the worst damages, Nordrhein-Westfalen. And at the same time, he is competing very much with the Green Party. And the Green Party now, of course, has a kind of advantage because they say, well, the flooding is a consequence of climate change. And the CDU, the conservative Angela Merkel's party, has always been more, well, there's climate change, but we also have to think of our economy. So it's very interesting to see now these both Spitzenkandidaten, the one from the Green and from the Conservatives, showing up in the floods and how they're bringing over their message. And this might be really a decisive factor for who wins the election.
Thank you, James.
Afghanistan. I mean, the media, the worldwide, is great at doing stories when flags are being pulled down and armies are going in and out. But we're always very bad at forgetting them. We move on. Yes. Syria, we've done it. We forget it. Afghanistan, the spread of the Taliban across Afghanistan, the capturing of border posts, the besieging of provincial capitals. We are seeing in some of these areas now controlled by the Taliban all the stuff we saw before. The women being forced to cloister away in homes, girls no longer being able to go to school, men forced to spend most of their day praying, told to grow their beards. All of that is happening again. And yes, there are talks taking place at Doha, and the Afghan president was in Uzbekistan today and talks. there are discussions going on, but the military reality on the ground is happening, and I don't think we can take our eyes off it because there is a real human cost to this.
A very brief last word on it, Michael. I mean, really brief.
On Afghanistan, simply the concern is there are several thousand people, contractors, translators, who've been working primarily for the Americans. They cannot be left behind, and there's a real worry because there's not an active plan to get them out.
Michael and Stephanie and James, thank you all very much. Thank you very much for your company. Dateline London back same time next week.